the application of goals and purpose to our communication. It could be anything from handling crisis to communicating or propagating a message throughout an organization. It is essentially just having clear intent and goals behind the communication that you're trying to accomplish. Remind yourself that communication is bidirectional and you really need
Mhm.
to invite the other person to listen to you. I like to say that communication is operationalized leadership. We lead through how we communicate. So the consequences of poor communication are very clear.
Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. If you've been listening to the Science of Leadership long, you know by now that communication is one of the four pillars of exceptional leadership. But how can we do it? More specifically, how can we be better at strategic communication? Today, I'm honored to have Matt Abrahams on the podcast. He teaches strategic communication at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. He's helped countless people refine their communication, including those speaking on some of the world's biggest stages. Additionally, he hosts the Think Fast, Talk Smart podcast and is the author of the book Think Faster, Talk Smarter. Matt, thank you for joining me on the Science of Leadership today.
So excited to be with you, Tom. Thank you.
Okay, Matt. So that you know what's coming here on the Science of Leadership, I like to employ a framework I know that you know all too well, and that's the what, so what, now what sort of approach. So with that in mind, if you boil it down concisely, what is strategic communication and what are the components of it?
So, strategic communication is the application of goals and purpose to our communication. It could be anything from handling crisis to communicating or propagating a message throughout an organization. It is essentially just having clear intent and goals behind the communication that you're trying to accomplish.
Okay, I like that. Very concise, and that helps us define our terms. Before we roll on further, though, I got to be honest, I'm curious. How did you become passionate about the concept of communication and teaching it to others?
Well, that's a great question. If you go back to my childhood, I am the son of a teacher. My mother taught elementary school and later English as a second language, and my father was a lawyer. And so both of them were always thinking about communication and how to be more effective. In my mother's case, it was really how do I engage the students that I'm teaching? In my father's case, it's how do I communicate clearly and get my points across? So it is, I grew up in an environment where it wasn't like they were lecturing me on communication by any means, but we certainly were having discussions about how to be more effective in our communication.
It's great that your parents were thoughtful enough, insightful enough to actually make that a priority. I think there's so many things in life that get going that taking the time, and I know from my own kids, trying to invest in them the importance of communication.
Yes.
Sometimes those things can get lost, even though they're so fundamental and important for success in life.
Absolutely, and there's a lot of impact people can have on their kids by just focusing on communication for sure.
I'm wondering if one of your students in the GSB asks, "What are the biggest challenges leaders face to being strategic communicators?" What would you tell them?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is just taking the time to focus on their communication. A lot of people, especially when it comes to strategic communication, are focused on whatever it is they're trying to handle in the moment, and they don't think about the importance of the communication in it. They see communication as a necessary evil, something
Mhm.
you do at the back end of dealing with the problem or dealing with the opportunity. And in fact, I believe, and I teach my students this, that you need to have communication you need to be thinking about it throughout the entire process of whatever it is you're dealing with. So as you're talking about handling the crisis, it's how are we messaging it? How are we being transparent? How are we structuring it? It's not just what do we have to do to fix whatever the mess is. So the biggest mistake I think people make at the highest level of strategic communication is they don't bring the communication to the party soon enough and they don't respect it enough. Because ultimately, all of these actions need communication in order to come to some kind of successful conclusion.
Do you think that that reality is perhaps why a lot of times people in leadership positions come off as heavy-handed because they're so focused on wanting to accomplish this thing that they didn't think about, "How am I gonna communicate this effectively?" So they just come off very, forceful. Do you think that's possible?
Certainly. I mean, I think there's a lot that leads for people to be heavy-handed. It partly is they don't think about their communication. They're just focused on whatever their goal is. Second, I think that you need to really remind yourself that communication is bidirectional, and you really need
Mhm.
to invite the other person to listen to you. And so we have to remind ourselves that communication is about connection. The root of the word communication is to make common. And the way we make common things common is through empathy and connection. And people who are heavy-handed are missing that. And they really need to remind themselves that it's about connecting with the other person and getting the message across and inviting that other person to be with us. And that's what leads to success in not just communication, but relationships. Because fundamentally, I like to say that communication is operationalized leadership. We
Mm,
lead through how we communicate. So we have to be very cognizant and thoughtful about the communications that we have.
yeah. I really like that idea. Communication is operationalized leadership. I may have to use that, at
Yeah,
some
you're
point moving
welcome to
forward.
it. Thank you.
Well, you hit on a concept that I discovered in a study that I did and our listeners know about, that's a part of my book that's coming out, this year.
Great.
And the concept, again, it was revelatory to me, but that may be just because I'm not an expert in communication like you, but it's not what you say, it's what they hear. So it really is
Mhm.
understanding the position and the orientation, the values, all the things that matter to your audience, and framing your communication in such a way that they receive the message you intend to send, um, as opposed to what, you're actually sending. So, anyway, I think that
I think that's
resonates really
very I
well.
mean, if you ask me what's the one thing people could do to improve their communication, it would be that point you just made. It's not about you, it's about the audience. You are always in service of your audience when you communicate. And the biggest mistake people make is they just think about getting their message out, broadcasting. But that's not what's important. It's how the audience receives the message. On the podcast I host, Think Fast, Talk Smart, I interview communication experts from a bunch of different fields. The most frequently response I get from them is you have to focus on your audience. They say it in a lot of different ways, but that is the essence of successful communication.
Yeah, well, thanks for, reiterating that, for us. Do you have a good, story that demonstrates really well what communication, strategic communication really looks like?
So, I have lots of stories of what strategic communication could look like. So, there was an organization that I was working with that brought me in because the problem that they identified was that they were having too many meetings and too many people were attending the meetings and the meetings were getting too unwieldy and things weren't going well. And so I came in and observed these meetings, and meetings are often band-aids for bigger strategic communication problems, right? When people
True.
can't communicate effectively, what do? They convene a meeting to bring everybody together to try to figure it out. And it turned out that what was going on was much bigger than these meetings. It was the fact that people there part of what I instruct or invite people to think about is three things when you are running an organization, leading a group. You need to put in place a communication infrastructure. And by that, I don't mean a particular tool, although tools play a role. You need to be thinking about people, process, and tools. So, who are the people that need to be communicated with, and in what ways do they need to be communicated? What are the processes we will use for effective communication? In other words, how do we cascade information and Do we do it differentially based on the different types of information we're cascading? And then finally, what tools do we need to equip people with? And this particular organization had not spent the time strategically thinking about the people, the process, or the tools. And so the meetings, huge, I mean, 70 people were showing up to these meetings. Um, that was the problem. And
Yeah.
so that's an example, I think, of strategic communication where you really have to take a step back and say, what are the things we're trying to communicate? What are the best ways to communicate them? And what are the people, process, and tools that we need to put in place to do that? So those are the things that people need to. That's an example, at least, of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, people, process, and tools. I think those are good points to keep in mind as we're thinking about how are we gonna do this.
Absolutely.
Um, Meetings, have been known to say, and I wasn't the one who coined this, but meetings are where minutes are kept and hours are lost. And so
Yes,
so
yes,
we
yes,
spend
yes.
so much time in meetings, and I think it is because, as you say, we haven't whomever it is, in the meeting, but we haven't taken the time to be thoughtful and to determine what really needs to be said and say it in a meaningful way.
Absolutely, that's correct.
Well, now that we've kinda covered what strategic communication is and what it looks like, now let's shift to the "so what," of this and say, why is it so important for leaders to be excellent at strategic communication?
Yeah. So, as I said, communication is operationalized leadership. And as such, to be an effective leader, we have to communicate effectively. And so we need to dedicate our time to thinking about that. Many leaders tell me that when they communicate well, things just progress better. And so
Yeah.
dedicating time to thinking about messaging, how to make it consistent, how to make it clear, are really important. And I happen to teach at a business school where we put a lot of priority on equipping our students with the skills they need, both the very technical aspects in terms of finance, in terms of accounting and specific leadership skills, but also on the day-to-day interactive skills like communication that really make a difference. So I think everybody needs to focus on that.
Yeah. As you think back across history, who could you this was something that as I was thinking about our conversation, it came to mind was somebody in history who comes to mind as an example of a leader who was really great at strategic communication.
I think there are many leaders who are great at strategic communication, some internally and some externally. So, an example of a great strategic communicator externally, I think people aren't going to be surprised by this, but I think Steve Jobs did a really effective job of communicating the strategy and vision of what Apple was and what it wanted to be. And so, having that focus on the future and a clear messaging, just very consistent and compelling as well, led to that effective, use of communication to be strategic.
Okay. So you differentiated internally and externally. And Jobs was a good example of an external communicator. Can you is there an internal communicator that comes to mind that you could say?
So, I've gotten to know because so Stanford University's new president, John Levin,
Mhm.
was the dean of the Graduate School of Business where I've been for 15 years. He was dean for over half of my tenure there, and he has now been promoted to be the president of Stanford. He is a really effective communicator, I think, externally, but also very good communicator internally, transparent, making sure to focus on what's important to those involved. All of that is really critical to being successful. And so I look to him as a good leader, period, but also as a really effective strategic communicator when it comes to a really large organization like a university. Those skills will serve him more well in his new role.
Yeah, well, and thanks for highlighting transparency, openness, those sorts of things that are important for creating that successful internal communication too. That's helpful. You've discussed why strategic communication is important. Can you speak a bit about the negatives that come when leaders aren't skilled at strategic communication? Or for that matter, do those who are poor at it not really get the opportunity to be leaders?
Well, unfortunately, that your second question is not the case. I think there are many people who become leaders for lots of reasons. Communication often is not one of them, but it usually rears its ugly head when that's the case. So the consequences of poor communication are very clear. It's confusion, it's redundancy of effort, it's people not feeling valued. Taking the time to communicate really helps an organization run more effectively.
Some of that answer, I think, probably gets at least tangentially came close to, the next question that I really had, and, I mean, this is the Science of Leadership podcast, so we definitely try to bring in the science on these things, but, can you share some of what the scientific literature says about the importance of strategic communication with regard to leadership success?
So, leadership has been studied for decades. I mean, you know better than I the specifics of it, and the variables that are often looked at include communication, sometimes explicitly named as communication, or it's the ramifications of the results of communication. And communication has been shown to be a really important predictor of success of actions of leaders, success of satisfaction with leaders, and success with the overall um, feeling of commitment to an organization, cohesiveness, if you will. So, leadership communication plays a huge role in how leaders are viewed, both internally by employees, their colleagues, and peers, as well as external factors like customers, prospects, and in some cases, the market.
Yeah, so that all does resonate very well with the leadership literature that shows that anytime that you're improving the relationship, the cohesion, the intent to stay, that's gonna improve long-term survival for your organization in this current climate where we have so much burnout, disengagement, lack of fulfillment, so forth. The ability to mitigate against that is highly important, extraordinarily valuable for anyone in a leadership position. So communication to do that to that end, I think is vital. And so I would say that it's probably worth people considering if they're in valuable leadership positions to actually have communication training. So I can say Matt, you may not know this, but I've I've been conducting this big study where I studied 4-star generals and admirals, and
Mm.
all of those folks actually go through training to improve their communication capabilities, like formal training, to be better communicators. That's how important it is, at least in the United States military, that that we actively invest in the development of those people in that way.
I'm not surprised by that at all. I think the military does some really good things when it comes to how they communicate and the importance they put on communication. I think there's some things that might be a little more rigid than I would recommend, but I'm not surprised at all that senior leaders in the military are supportive of this notion of leadership.
Well, Matt, we've covered the what and the so what. Now we're to the now what portion of the podcast, and you touched on that a little bit earlier. But what are the tangible things, the tips that you can give our listeners to help them become the most effective strategic communicators that they can be, recognizing that you teach a curriculum on these things, and so this isn't necessarily something that can be boiled down to a 2-minute soundbite or things of that nature, but some tips that you could give practically to our listeners.
Well, let me step back as I give this information. So, when it comes to any communication, strategic communication being an important part, there are only three ways to get better at it: repetition, reflection, and feedback. You got to practice. You got to reflect on what's working and what's not, and you have to get feedback from trusted others. We're not the best judges of our communication. So that underlies all attempts at improvement or development of communication skills. That said, there's some very specific things that I think people should do to be better communicators. First, as we mentioned, you have to think about your audience. You have to really understand. You have to do reconnaissance, reflection, and research into your audience to better understand their needs and then tailor your messages accordingly. That's number one. Number two, you need to Make sure that any information that you provide is structured. It has to be structured, not just lists of information. There has to be a logic to the information. What, so what, now what is an example of a structure. In our world today, attention is the most precious commodity, I would argue. So you have to find ways to engage the audience. How, why, and how should they pay attention? So your messages need to include engaging, relevant content. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, beyond knowing your audience, you have to listen. Strategic communication is not just about getting information out, it's about receiving information and then based on it, tailoring. So if people are able to appreciate their audience, structure their content, make it engaging, and listen to be interactive, then I think we have a great chance of being successful.
Those are exceptional. Thank you for sharing those. I'm gonna
Mm.
definitely write those down. They'll be in the show notes and those sorts of things, obviously, but for my own sake, and study on those because I think those really are excellent. And I'm very much a person about structure and things that are portable so that people can remember them, and cognitive, frameworks is what I refer to them as. So that's really helpful for me. Thanks for sharing those. One thing before we go, actually there will be two, but this the
Mhm.
last kind of question, um, and I think you already hit on this, so I'll ask you for another one. But if you had to pick one aspect of strategic communication that you think is the must-have, and we already covered that one, so maybe the second must-have, what would it be and why?
Yeah. So jumping off from the know your audience, the next must have beyond structure is to have a clear goal. Communication needs to be goal directed. And a goal to me has three parts: information, emotion, and action. What do you want the audience to know? How do you want them to feel? And what do you want them to do? Most of us fixate on the knowing part, and we don't often tailor it to the audience. So we have to do that. We have to understand the audience, tailor the information. But we have to think about how we want people to feel. We've known for millennia, thousands of years, that emotion matters. Neuroscience has taught us more recently that emotion gets into our brains differently than information. So we have to think about, do we want people excited or concerned, fear of missing out or validated, confident? How do we want them to feel? And make sure that we build into our messaging the things that get them to feel that way. And then second, in addition, I'm sorry, third is, what do we want them to do? Many of us are too vague. We're not clear. You need to be specific. If you're an entrepreneur pitching for money, you need to say, I would like your investment. Don't just say, I want your support. Support is too vague. We need to be
Yeah,
specific. So those are having a clear goal. Once you understand your audience, I would say is probably the second most important thing.
brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. Um, I'm sure there are a lot of listeners out there who are like, "This guy is phenomenal. Where can we learn more about him? Where can we, get more
Well,
information?"
that would be
Other than
lovely if people thought that.
Yeah, other
I'm
than
just a
this
guy
book,
who's yeah, well, thank you. I'm glad you have that. I'm just a guy who's trying to work on my own communication and help others. So, single best place to go to learn about my work is fastersmarter.io. It's a website, fastersmarter.io. It connects you to Think Fast, Talk Smart, the podcast all about communication, 20-minute episodes. The book you talked about, Think Faster, Talk Smarter. You can see I'm pretty on brand or just not creative with names. Can help people feel better about spontaneous speaking. I'm a huge user of LinkedIn if people want to connect in with me that way. But fastersmarter.io will give you is the gateway to all the things that I talk about.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for being on the show today, for sharing all your insights and wisdom about communication. I think, this is really gonna be helpful for me and hopefully for our listeners as well. Thanks for being on the Science of Leadership. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for the good work that you do. I love that you bring an academic, scientific approach to the very important concept of leadership.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.